Welcome to this IIEA webinar on the topic of the role of the private sector in warfare. And to discuss this topic, we're delighted to be joined today by Mr. Franklin Kramer, Distinguished Fellow and Board Director at the Atlantic Council, who has been very good enough to take time out of his schedule to speak to us. It is the situation that since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Western states have learned important lessons about the role of the private sector in wartime, including how to counter cyber attacks, ensuring the continuity of government, and ensuring the integrity of communications. In these areas, the private sector has played an important role, providing expertise and resources that governments themselves may not have had. And their capacity to augment national security, of course, risks making the private sector targets possibly of hostile aggression. To discuss these lessons, Dr. Kramer will speak to us for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will go to a question and answer with our audience. Just to mention that today's talk and the question and answers are both on the record, and you'll be able to join the question and answers using the Q&A function on Zoom. And also feel free to join the discussion on Twitter, which is using the handle @IIEA. Now let me formally introduce Mr. Kramer. Frank, as we have been, he has allowed us to call him, is a distinguished fellow and board director at the Atlantic Council. He has served as a senior political appointee in 2 administrations, including Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. At the US Department of Defense, Frank was in charge of the formulation and implementation of international defense and political military policy, with worldwide responsibilities and including NATO and Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Outside of his formal responsibilities in the non-profit world, he has been a senior fellow at CNA, which is the National Security Independent Analysis Security Body, chairman of the board of the World Affairs Council of Washington, D.C., a distinguished research fellow at the Center for Technology and National Security Policy at National Defense University, and an adjunct professor at Elliott School of International Affairs in Washington. His main areas of focus include defense, both conventional and hybrid, China, managing competition, military power, NATO and Russia, and of course, Ukraine, cyber, including resilience and international issues, and also trade and globalization. He has also written extensively on China, NATO, trade, and also most recently Ukraine, given the situation and the war there, on which he has written, and also on the private sector now, on which he will speak to us, the role of the private sector in warfare. So may I hand over the floor to you, and we look forward to hearing your talk, Frank.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk with you and also ultimately with the audience, and I look forward to the interactions with the audience. So as indicated, what I want to talk about today is the role of the private sector in warfare. And if one thing is taken away from this conversation, it's that role really now is indispensable. It's indispensable to the effective conduct of warfare. It's indispensable to all that militaries might do. Militaries, of course, will lead, but the private sector now has a role that has not really historically been what it's been done before. It always is involved in what you might call the defense industrial base, providing capabilities and the like, but now it's really involved in operations. I've called this the 6th domain. I did that sort of deliberately, half tongue-in-cheek, basically to differentiate it, but also to compare it to the other domains of warfare that are well known, so air, land, sea, space, and cyber. What the 6th domain is, from my perspective, is an operational domain which requires coordinated activities by the private sector in warfare. And what I mean by warfare is kinetic warfare, actual ongoing fighting, as compared to what's happening now, which is also a problem, of course, so-called hybrid warfare. What the private sector needs to do and the governments need to do is to ensure that the private sector is actually fully included. There need to be mechanisms, if you will, for inclusion. There need to be thinking through what warfighting constructs would be. There need to be actual plans to engage the private sector in an appropriate way. There need to be preparations in advance of any wartime activities, including training, so that we don't come, if ultimately and unfortunately there is a conflict, we don't come to have what you might call a pickup game. We're well thought through, well advantaged. We understand what everyone needs to do. It's really quite important to think about which parts of the private sector would be most engaged because it's not the entirety. And in particular, what I'll be focusing on today will be the information technology firms, the critical infrastructures, and space in terms of operation. Now, there is another sector that's obviously enormously important, and that's providing the capabilities. So, if you will, a great deal of effort is focused, of course, on unmanned vehicles. A great deal of effort is focused on ammunition, and that is quite important. That's more traditional, so to speak, in terms of being the industrial base. I'm more focused today about actual operational activities, although I'm quite happy if the audience would like to talk about the industrial base. I do have some thoughts about that. Why the sixth domain is really important, I think, can be understood best by taking a look at some of the concerns that we, at least in the United States, and I think others also do, but since I'm from the US, I'm going to focus a little bit on what we're seeing here in the United States. So both China and Russia are potential adversaries. And what we see happening with China these days is significant intrusions via cyber into the critical infrastructures in the United States. There's a whole host of intrusions under the title, it's called Volt Typhoon. And those are intrusions into the critical infrastructure companies in the US. It's hundreds, if not thousands, of intrusions. They've been discovered. Most of them have been expelled, but whether or not there are still intrusions by the Chinese into these areas is hard to be sure, and we continuously see efforts coming from China to continue that kind of intrusion. There's another set of intrusions into what might be called the telecommunications companies. It goes under another name called Salt Typhoon. That was successful in accessing the communications of actually millions of people, including high-level people during the campaign. For example, the vice presidential candidate, now Vice President Vance's communications were attacked. So we have all these continuous activities by the Chinese, and we would know that in a warfare situation, they would undertake the same kind of thing. With respect to Russia, if we look, for example, at the threat assessment that the U.S. intelligence community puts out each year, what they say is, with a high degree of certainty, if there were a conflict with Russia, the Russians would attack the critical infrastructures in the United States. They would attack what are called the industrial control systems that control the operations of the electric grid, of railroads, of ports, of water, airplanes, airfields, pipelines, and the like. They would also attack undersea cables. And we all know how important undersea cables are to international communications, to the economies of virtually every country, and certainly in the West, and to defense also. These risks apply not only to the U.S., I was using the U.S. as an example, but also to NATO countries, of course. How they specifically apply to Ireland, I'd leave that to your analysis because obviously Ireland is not part of NATO, but it is part of the European Union, and it's active certainly in the European Union. And from my perspective, especially with the European Union taking the actions that it has, including what's going on today with respect to defense, it would be um, it would be likely, in my opinion, that if there were a conflict, the European Union itself as an institution would be attacked, and so I think with many of the countries of the European Union. So I think there's a high degree of thinking that needs to be done, even for EU countries that are not in NATO. If one wants to get another perspective, one can look, of course, with respect to the role of the private sector as to what's now ongoing in Ukraine. And it gives one an idea what warfare would look like and what the private sector's role would be. And there in Ukraine, I think we can see that there are at least 5 different sectors in which the private sector is playing important functional roles. Cybersecurity would be one, cloud computing another, space a third, artificial intelligence a fourth, and communications a fifth. The private sector is playing both defensive and offensive roles. So it's not just playing defense. It's obviously not shooting the weapons, but it's providing a lot of support on the offensive side as well as on the defensive side. So walking down those different arenas that I just mentioned, with respect to cybersecurity, one sees multiple firms like Google or Microsoft or ESET from Europe providing assistance to the Ukraine government, to Ukraine companies, and for that matter, to people. It's an effort to ensure the resilience of the various functionalities inside of Ukraine, that the government works, the economy works, people can communicate with one another. The second area, of course, is cloud computing. And I say, of course, because the Ukraine government did something very smart just prior to the war. They took essentially all the governmental functions at the central government level and uploaded them to the cloud, to a cloud that was outside of Ukraine. So that meant that even if the Russians were successful in affecting the governmental functions on the computers that were in Ukraine, the functionality itself continued because the information could come from the cloud, the communications could come from the cloud, and that has worked really very, very well. The third area, space. Pretty much everyone, well, many people have heard of Starlink, of course. Starlink is a communications capability provided by the SpaceX company. It has small ground receivers that are very inexpensive, and the information itself comes from the large constellation of so-called low Earth orbit satellites run by SpaceX that have several thousand up there, and the communications continue even despite the efforts by the Russians to block. So space becomes an enormously important area. Artificial intelligence is utilized to coordinate, aggregate and coordinate information. Particularly useful for militaries to understand what the circumstances are on the battlefield and to utilize it for targeting type purposes. And then the fifth area is communications, which overlaps all of what I'm talking about before. But an interesting and very important part to think about in terms of the private sector's capabilities is in the communications area. From time to time, the Russians will succeed, both either kinetically or through cyber, in blocking communications. But unlike a circumstance where an adversary is seeking to steal data, and if you steal it once, you have it, in communications, you may go down, but you can come back up. So the ability to reconstitute, and that sometimes if it's a kinetic strike, involves physical reconstitution. If it's a cyber strike, it involves bringing back up the code and to be able to operate. There's a great deal of resilience in communications. So it's not one and done. It's how can we be as resilient as possible? And that involves making sure that you have people who understand how to deal with if you will, a serious intrusion. So what are the requirements, at least from my perspective, with respect to being an effective situation in which the private sector can really work well with the government? And I think the first requirement is what I would call having some kind of coordinating council, a group, an authorized group that includes both the government and the private sector. Just prior to when we went on the air, Finland was mentioned as a country that has done quite a lot. And the Finland model is a model that has been usefully looked at by many, many countries. They call it comprehensive security. They involve the central government, of course. They involve local authorities, both regional and municipal. They involve businesses of all kinds, large and small. They involve universities, and they involve research organizations. And what they're doing is they're bringing them together, not always everybody in every meeting, but they have a system that allows them to bring together to issue information to one another and also, as necessary, to issue directives. It's important to say that the central government can't run everything. And the Finns certainly have recognized this. They point out that regional is key, regional preparedness plans. Certainly in the United States is a big country, and you can't run everything from Washington, but I think that's true for smaller countries. So I think that would be just as true for Ireland as it is for Finland, thinking regional as well as central. It's critical to have what I call highly capable cybersecurity providers. That can include what are called the hyperscalers. Those are the Microsofts, the Googles, the Amazon Web Services type of companies. Also include companies that are more focused just on cybersecurity. In the United States, companies like CrowdStrike or Palo Alto or Dragos. Again, there are plenty of European companies that are very, very competent. Those companies have to be engaged with whatever governmental actions are being focused with respect to cybersecurity, and particularly on, if you will, on the defensive side to provide protection to the critical infrastructures. Personnel becomes a very important set of issues. In the event of a conflict, the requirements for additional personnel would be high. That's particularly true in the cyber arena. A number of countries have or are starting to have cyber reserve systems. Those are not military reserves. Estonia, the UK, each have cyber reserves. They're alongside, if you will, what the military might provide. So the people who join don't have to meet military physical requirements. They just have to be good cyber people, so to speak. And the terms are different in Estonia and in the UK, and I think each country can decide on whether it wants a cyber reserve or how that cyber reserve might be organized. But again, it's an opportunity to provide support to the country for people who are interested in doing so, again, in the event of conflict. If you're going to be in the cyber reserve, you can't just join when the conflict starts. You have to, join earlier. It has to involve planning, training, etc. So thinking through how to utilize a cyber reserve is an important element of being ready, so to speak, an important element of making sure that the private sector's role in warfare will actually be effective. Threat hunting. Again, this is a cyber kind of thing, but as I mentioned earlier, we see the Chinese, we see the Russians, thinking about undercutting the effective operation of critical infrastructures. One way to deal with that, of course, is to be hunting inside the code, inside the critical infrastructures themselves, to see whether or not there's any malware there and to expel the malware. That's a continuous type of process. It has to be continuous monitoring. It should be done before any conflict, but it certainly would need to be done during a conflict. To make that effective, one has to plan, one has to organize, one has to train who's going to do what. How does a private sector firm interact with the governmental organizations? So, for example, in the United States, we have the critical infrastructure, cybersecurity and critical infrastructure agency. That's a governmental agency. We have all these private sector firms. How are we going to put them together? Another area, of course, are undersea cables. Undersea cables, provide huge amounts of information. In fact, they run most of the information among countries these days, some, of course, through satellites. Ireland itself has undersea cables. It also has some new ones that, as I understand, are being built. And then the Irish Sea itself has many, some of which are connected to Ireland, some not. So protecting undersea cables is a problem. One has to be able to monitor them. It's a problem that's been noticed by many. NATO has set up an organization, it's headquartered in the UK, to deal with undersea issues. A number of countries have come together, particularly in the North Sea, to work on undersea together. The Baltic, of course, is an area that we've seen cables affected, shall we say. So how to deal with undersea is a big issue. That brings one to how does one really monitor that? I mentioned briefly unmanned vehicles. There are unmanned vehicles that are called underwater unmanned vehicles that can be relatively inexpensive. And so developing a UUV fleet, an unmanned underwater vehicle fleet, to provide the necessary monitoring is one way to think about that. That, of course, is a role for the private sector. Repair. If a cable is broken, someone needs to repair it. There are all too few repair ships in the world, let alone in the United States or Europe. So expanding that repair fleet, again, is very, very important. I mentioned communications. I mentioned Starlink. As many on this call probably know, there were a few bumps, so to speak, in Starlink's provision of communications during the Ukraine war, particularly towards the beginning. In the United States, at least, we have what's called the Defense Production Act, and that basically allows the president, if he determines, to require the provision of both services or goods, but services in this case, if necessary. It can preempt any commercial contracts, although there's indemnification and so that the company wouldn't be hurt. But it's important for countries to think about how they would ensure the provision of services from the private sector, because private sector companies are busy doing other things, many of them, and how they relate to what would be necessary in wartime, again, needs to be thought about, and there needs to be the appropriate legislative capabilities. That raises the issue, of course, of resources. The private sector can't be, well, it can be, but it won't work very well if it has to provide all these capabilities for free. So that it's important, again, in terms of the planning, in terms of the legislation and the like, to make provision for the appropriate resourcing of what the private sector be asked to do. This amounts to, contracts which are done regularly, of course, but it needs to be thought about as opposed to just trying to do it on the fly in the event. Other areas that are very important, I already mentioned space. Communications technologies are critically important, and space is one place where the private sector, especially these days, has gone far ahead of the public sector. I mentioned low Earth orbit satellites. SpaceX is not the only one, but there are many up there, and will be more, and they need to be integrated. Again, artificial intelligence for targeting, and for different things also. So if one's on the continent, if there were a actual conflict, one could expect various logistics hubs to be affected by the fighting. So if a normal route, say a railroad route, is taken out, what's the alternative? Well, artificial intelligence could help figure that out on a very quick basis. A human being could figure it out also, of course, but we might as well take advantage of the abilities of artificial intelligence to do what some people call dynamic rerouting and the like. So bringing artificial intelligence into thinking through, and then of course that requires the private sector firms that have the artificial intelligence capability to previously been engaged, to know what they might be asked, to have the data that would be relevant and the like. I mentioned already cyber offense briefly. Private firms should not do cyber offense on their own, but in the context of war and working with the government, they could act as a cyber reserve. They could provide information on the one hand. They do have capabilities to keep people off their own networks, for example, if you're a hyperscaler, and they could be a really good resource. So let me stop there, if that's a useful overview of what I've been thinking about. And I look forward to talking with you further.